Okay, good morning, everyone, on the America side of Atlantic, and good afternoon for everyone in Europe, and good evening in Asia. This is one of what we hope was going to be a regular series of Brink Live events on really significant and salient topics for corporate executives around the world. And I hope you find this interesting. It'll last for 45 minutes. We've got two excellent experts on the subject. And the subject today, as you know, is regulators and antitrust. Whether or not regulators on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and in America, are managing to curb the power of these big tech companies, such as Apple and Meta and Google, or whether, in fact, it's just too big a job and the tech companies are gaining more and more power every day. There's hardly a day seems to go by without big tech in the newspaper. Of course, today we've got Elon Musk again battling it out with Twitter. I'm sure we'll get to that. I'm sure that's something regulators might be interested in at some stage. But first of all, let me just introduce the guests. So we have on the European side, Alexandre Streel, who is Professor of European Law at Namur University and Academic Director at the Center on Regulation in Europe, CERRE. His main areas of research are regulation and competition policy in the digital space. And he has been advising the European Commission and the European Parliament on the regulation of online platforms. He holds a PhD in law from the European University Institute and a master's in economics from the University of Louvain. And then representing the transatlantic, the American space, is Randall Picker, a professor of law at the University of Chicago, who has clerked for Judge Richard Posner of the US Appeals Court in the Seventh Circuit and spent 3 years with Sidley and Austin LLP in Chicago, where he worked on areas of debt restructuring and corporate reorganization. Randy is a member of the National Bankruptcy Conference, and his main areas are laws related to intellectual property, competition policy, and regulated industries. He's also the co-author of Game Theory and the Law, and he teaches classes in antitrust, network industries, and secured transactions. So two excellent guests who are going to talk us through, I'm sure not always agree with everything that each other say, but talk us through what is going on in antitrust. So welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us in.
Let's start with you, Randy. So just maybe give us an overview for a few minutes about what the state of play is in Congress, because I know there's several bills in front of Congress. Are they progressing? Could you just outline exactly, what the scope of each of them are and which industries or companies might be most affected?
Sure. So as you know, we're at a very interesting point with regard to these big tech firms. We've got antitrust cases pending in the United States, but man, those are going to take a while, and it's not clear what the results of those will be. That's the nature of litigation, and Alex may talk about what's happened in Europe on that. A lot of litigation, not very much accomplished. So people are looking for different tools, and those tools are the new legislation, possible new legislation that you mentioned in Congress. There are bills pending in the House, bills pending in the Senate. You sort of look at, well, what's the intersection of those two? What does that look like? That seems to be the best way to bet as to what might happen. So I'll highlight two ideas. So there's one bill, Amy Klobuchar, who I went to law school with, so Senator Klobuchar, has a bill, the Open Apps Market Act. The idea there is really to focus at its heart on the smartphones, the smartphone platforms, the app stores associated with that. That obviously means Apple and Google, maybe even more Apple than Google. Part of that would require alternative app stores, side loading, if you like that word. So the Apple platform would be opened up, but it would also address things like in-app payments. There is, again, litigation between Apple and Epic in the United States, where Epic is obviously very unhappy about the 30% figure that they pay when transactions flow through Apple, the App Store, and the in-app payment system. Spotify is unhappy in Europe. and then more access to the underlying tools of the platform. So a way of opening up the app stores, I think Senator Klobuchar, her colleagues would say, to foster competition. Okay, that's one bill, S 2710, if you want numbers. There's a second one.
And where,
go ahead.
Just pause on that. I mean, so where has it got to? Is it out of committee yet? Has there been any votes on that one?
Yes, it is out of committee. And, you know, they had an initial version in August. There's a revised version as of February. And you know, there it sits. And so it's not clear, certainly not clear to me. Maybe clear to Washington insiders, and I am not that, whether that will progress or not. There is, again, there's comparable legislation in the House that is out of committee as well. So in that sense, a next step could be teed up, but I think it's very hard to know what will happen there.
And obviously the clock is ticking, right, with the midterms coming up, and which could change
all of
the configuration.
Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, obviously gave a speech in the last week, you know, very much attacking the bill. Though obviously Apple's been doing that behind the scenes, I'm sure, the entire time. But Cook went public. And Apple's concerns there, and I wrote a piece about this, is that if you actually look at security and malware issues on Apple versus Google Play seems to have much more malware. And the fact that you can do other stores there and that sideloading is possible seems to mean that there's more malware in that ecosystem than there is in the Apple system. So I think Apple's got reason to worry about what might happen to the security of the platform. That's obviously part of what Apple sells.
But obviously they've got a big self-interest in maintaining the monopoly.
They have a huge self-interest. Yeah. And look, people have been saying, back in the old days, IBM said, you can't put your punch cards in my machine because they'll mess up the machine. So these types of issues, those have been out there forever. Okay, I'm happy
and before we get on to others, I mean, maybe you will get onto this, but why has Amy Klobuchar and others focused on this particular thing? Why did she kind of hone in on the apps?
Well, so I was going to stand up and go to my bookshelf, I guess. So she has a book, an antitrust book. And we were on law review together. So, you know, many years ago. And look, I think she thinks antitrust should have a powerful political valence. I think she tells that history, Minnesota farmers. And, you know, she ran for president and she'd like to run for president again. So I think she's hoping that this issue is going to sell. Now, look, this is, to go to your point, I do not understand why she thinks she's the politician. I'm not. Some of this could change how we use these devices, I think, in a big way. And why she wants to muck up that experience isn't clear to me.
Interesting. Okay, sorry, we got distracted. So what else is in front of
exactly. So she's got a second bill. So if you don't like the first one, try the second one. She's got a number of them, and supposedly she's got another one she's going to introduce. I was in another one the other day. And we'll see. So the second one is sort of a broader one, and that's S 2992. Again, if we're doing numbers, there's this whole idea that people who are opposed to the tech platforms have managed to sell, which is something called self-preferencing. And the self-preferencing idea is that Apple, Google, Amazon really are advantaging their own products relative to competitive products. So when Spotify launched a complaint in Europe, Spotify said, I'll hold this up, we can't get access to the Apple Watch the way Apple Music can. That's unfair. It's not level competition. It distorts competition. So the bill that I'm talking about has a variety of provisions, but at its core, it's all about this kind of discrimination where the platforms are, as it were, advantaging themselves. Now, look, that is the most normal behavior in business. No, I have never walked into a McDonald's and had them say, you know, our French fries, they're pretty good. If there's a place down the street, killer. Sure. That's where you really, it doesn't work that way. Someone walks into your store, you try to sell them your product. So, but the self-preferencing idea is to suggest that there needs to be some sort of level playing field with regard to these big tech platforms on products where Apple, Google, Amazon, and the rest are in competition with others.
This feels like a very old topic in a way. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Microsoft, controversies around 2000, right?
Yes.
In which there was talk about exactly the same thing. That Microsoft was preferencing its own
so yes,
browser
exactly.
and so forth.
Yes. So yes, and Alex, that's all Europe, but not all, but we did this in the United States too, but certainly on the browser and certainly on the media player. And look, anti-discrimination. I'm teaching a class right now on platforms and networks. The 1887 Interstate Commerce Act said to railroads, you can't self-preference. Didn't put it that way, but anti-discrimination was part of that. So it's an incredibly old idea. If we're switching from pure antitrust to treating these more like, public utilities and the like.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to that very interesting subject. Anything else we should be aware of in Congress?
No, I should let Alex talk.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you, Randy, very much. We'll come back. Okay, Alex, what's going on in Brussels?
Yeah, so I mean, the title of this conversation is state versus platform, and I think 2022 in Europe will be seen as a year really where we have a paradigm shift, and from the independence of the cyberspace to the states taking back control of this cyberspace. And so whether it will be good for consumer, that I think should be the right question, not necessarily whether the state or the platform will win, but in any case, if the debate is in that direction, I think clearly the state have won in 2022 in Europe, because there will be two laws which will be adopted. One has already been agreed and the other one will be agreed this month. So the first one is the Digital Market Act, and that is really the goal. It's only applicable to the big tech, so only to the biggest one. And the goal of that law is to ensure more contestability and fairness on the digital market. So the idea being that if you are a new player, you should be able, it should be more easy for you to enter in the cyberspace. And how that is achieved with two main categories of obligation. One relates really more to prohibition of anti-competitive practices, because we think in Europe that antitrust is too slow and also not good at remedy, design and monitoring. And so basically those prohibitions are very close to what we have in the different US bill that Randy was just mentioning. So we have, for instance, a prohibition of self-preferencing. We also have a prohibition of you cannot use the business user data to promote your own product. Now, as we know, there are some discussion whether Amazon is doing that on the platform to promote their own product. So a number of prohibition, but also, and that is probably one is the most revolutionary, if you want, a number of access obligations. So really the idea of the Digital Market Act is to open the platform and the data, not to break them up. So this is not the strategy which is followed in Europe, but to open them up, with, for instance, a number of interoperability obligation, horizontal interoperability obligation. For instance, now a communication app will have to be interoperable. So you could send a message from Messenger to iMessage, for instance. Vertical interoperability. This is the point that Randy was mentioning with Epic and Apple, or Spotify and Apple. And then a number of data sharing obligations. So for instance, Bing now could have access to the search data of Google to improve their own algorithm. So, I mean, this is an extremely important law. It has been agreed in March, so last month, and it will enter into force in different phases. But I think the two main important dates are the designation of the gatekeeper that will happen in spring or summer next year. And then 6 months after that designation, the obligation and the prohibition will be applicable to those big tech companies. So I think the application will be early 2024. So there will be a number of 1 year and a half to let's say put that into practice. So that's the first big piece of law. And then we have another big piece.
Just hang on, Alex, just before we go on to the next one. So just to underline the program, it's been passed, correct?
Yeah.
The legislation.
So
but it's still going to be like 18 months before it becomes law.
So it's a bit more complicated than that, because Europe is complex, it's a multinational democracy, so it's not easy to run. But the idea is that it has been politically agreed in March. Now they are refining the details, so it will be published in the official journal of the European Union in October of this year. But I mean, all these steps now are just finalization. So there is no more political game to be played, you know, at this stage. And then the European Commission, which will be the enforcer of that new piece of legislation, will have to adopt a number of implementing acts or executive order, if you want, and then they will have to designate and so on. So this is why it takes a little bit of time.
Okay. And then, sorry, my other question on this is, how will they determine the threshold for being a gatekeeper? I mean, is it on size? Is it on annual revenue? Yes. How's it determined?
There is a rebuttable presumption that you are a gatekeeper subject to the law if you if you are meeting a number of size indicators in terms mostly of market cap and in terms of the user you have. So that's and in terms of the turnover you have. So it's in a way an easy indicator, but it's just a rebuttable presumption. So if you say, okay, I am very big, but a lot of my users are multi-homing across platform, and therefore I am not a gatekeeper, because if you are a business user, you can reach the end user through another means, through another platform. They may try to rebut that presumption. But again, to be fair, I think that the 5 big US platforms will be in, and I think it will be extremely complicated for them to try to rebut the presumption. But theoretically, let's say it's possible. But you know, the law is predicted to target between 15 and 20 companies. Because you know, there was this discussion whether it's just US company, and so this is why the threshold have been enlarged a little bit and are much lower than the threshold that you find in the US bill, in fact. And so, for instance, Booking.com or Zalando possibly could be in, also Alibaba could be in. So it will be mostly the US big tech, but probably other non-US big tech will be covered as well.
And one thing you said at the end of your description, thank you, by the way, for that description of the act, it was very clear, was this access to other people's analytics, if I understood this correct. So like you said, Brink might be able to access Google's analytics again. Now, GDPR, which is another huge piece of European legislation, has kind of stopped that from happening, right? I mean, under privacy laws. So are these 2 big European acts to some degree in kind of conflict with each other, do you think?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there is, well, conflict. I mean, there is a trade-off, let's say. And, you know, the law has been adopted, but as many people, observers have noted, that was the easy part. You know, the very complex part will be the implementation of this law, this interpretation of all those provisions. Because, you know, the European Commission is often saying, I mean, it will be easy. All those provisions are self-executing. And of course, that's a joke. I mean, nothing self-executing in the digital market, because they are complex and evolving all the time. So, you know, the big challenges will be how to interpret those provisions to each business model of those platforms. And one of the big difficulty in that interpretation exercise will be exactly what you described, this trade-off between, on the one hand, the contestability, or if you want, the opening the platform, and on the other hand, preserving the privacy of their user, and as Randy was mentioning, the security of the system. And so the balancing act is not really done in the DMA. It is just left to the interpretation of the law. And so I guess that now, between now and 2024, and maybe later on in court, there will be a lot of discussion between the European Commission on the one hand and the big tech on the other hand, to say, okay, how we place how we play out that trade-off, which is very real, as Randy was saying. And so the question is, and that is still left to interpretation. And you know, I also predict that even in 2024, I mean, there will be a lot of challenges and so on. So, you know, I think this law at the beginning will not have a lot of effect. You know, because as and it's only maybe in 2026, you know, after some years of implementation, that you will see the business model changing. So my point is not a lot of effect on the short term, but a lot of effect on the longer term, because of this paradigm shift. You know, it's, I mean, the permissionless innovation environment that the big tech had in Europe is over.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's I think a very important point. Okay, let's get it. You said there was a second act. What's
Yes,
the second
and the second act is very different. It's about content moderation and also recommended system and targeting system. And that is the Digital Services Act, which has not yet been agreed politically, but the aim is to agree by the end of this month, and the negotiation between the EU lawmakers are progressing very well. And so here the idea is that we keep the liability exemption. So the equivalent of the Section 230 in the US is kept. Okay, so they are not, I mean, platforms are not liable for the illegality of the content or illegality of the product, if you are a marketplace, on the platform, in principle. That's kept, and I think that's very good. But as a quid pro quo, if you want, for having kept this liability exemption, they will have to do more action to try to spot illegality on the platform, so illegal content or illegal product. And if they find them, they have to remove it relatively quickly. So that's the idea, you know, you keep the liability obligation, but you have some due process obligation or process obligation to make the internet safer. And the DSA, so the Digital Services Act, will apply to every platform, small and big. So that's very different from the DMA, but with more obligation for the biggest one, which are called the very large online platform. So, and that is the platform which have more than 45 million million user in the European Union. And those will be subject to a little bit more transparency obligation, more due diligence obligation, and also a very important new obligation of doing some systemic risk assessment of their product. So again, you know, when I was saying the permissionless environment that we had before in big tech is over, that's also an indication of that, because, you know, before launching a new product, they will have to do a kind of assessment of what those products are creating for human rights, for instance, for democracy. I mean, don't ask me how it will be done, because nobody knows. It will be extremely complicated, but that's the idea.
And I mean, at the moment, there's obviously a lot of pressure on these platforms to kind of do that, right? To take off, you know, sites that have pedophilia on them or whatever. You know, how is it going to change between what they're doing now and what they'll have to do under this act?
Because what they do now is very much under the pressure either of their user or the brand which are selling advertising there, or it's done in the shadow of the law, in the sense that it's co-regulation, but in the shadow of the law that they are doing because they threat that there is a law coming, you know. And so now what will happen is that you have a law, I think the obligations are a little bit clearer and are in the hard law, not only a voluntary agreement, a voluntary commitment that the platform are doing. So, you know, will it change in practice? I think so, because it will incentivize them, oblige them to do even more than what they are doing now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. Really interesting. Coming back to you, Randy, I mean, Alex's point, which I think is a really important one, about the idea of the permissionless environment being over for these guys. Do you think that's the case in the US as well?
Well, so I do think, you know, depending on obviously what's passed and what's not passed. As I was reviewing these potential bills yesterday, I was struck by the sense of the extent to which they could slow down innovation. And slow down innovation by the big tech firms, because as Alex was just suggesting, the more you make them, as it were, filter up front, it slows down. And so, and look, that's a trade-off. Maybe it means that we've you know, put a brake on the big firms, and the smaller firms and I'll have more space. I think some people have that idea in mind. I do want to say that I think, you know, these big tech firms can be a real source of innovation. And so I think we should be nervous, and I think there's a history associated with this, of taking the big tech firms off the table. The United States government brought an antitrust lawsuit against AT&T in 1949. That case settled in an agreed settlement in 1956. That effectively blocked AT&T from going into the computer business. AT&T had discovered the future in 1947 when it invented the transistor. The whole world of semiconductors that we live in is shaped by that moment. The 1956 final judgment required AT&T to license those to basically everyone. Maybe they would have done that anyhow. It's a complicated discussion, but the point I really want to make here is it also limited AT&T to being in the telecommunications business. And so they couldn't do computers just when computers were starting. I think if AT&T had been able to go into computers, that would have changed the competition between AT&T and the behemoth that IBM became. So I think we should be nervous about taking these big tech firms out of competition. Apple's entry into silicon, I think, has been great. And I think that's really spurring additional competition there in a way that we should find really attractive.
I mean, it's not presumably a kind of total zero sum, is it? I mean, it's not taking it off the table or not taking it off the table. I mean, there must be ways of kind of regulating their growth, as it were.
Depends on what we do, right? I mean, again, we
Right.
did exactly that in 1956 for AT&T when we reset telecommunications. And I think, at least in the United States, I think the 1996 Telecommunications Act has a feel that compares to some of what we're seeing here in terms of regulating big tech. We, again, certainly limited what some of these companies could do. And you're taking big, sophisticated firms off the table. That's not the proposal here yet. I want to be clear. But
Right.
It is a proposal to match what Alex was saying that will clearly, I think, slow these firms down.
What about, I mean, it was you who raised this idea of, treating them as public utilities because of their ubiquitousness in the marketplace and the fact that now everyone has it and everyone has a phone and so forth. I mean, that would seem on the surface to be a powerful argument. Do you think that that's got legs, as it were, that idea?
Well, I mean, I think that's what we're doing. I mean, Alex can tell me how the DMA differs from public utility regulation. But look, when I talk about, I'm talking about this legislation in my platforms and networks class, and that's a course that's about the regulation of natural monopoly, railroads and telegraph at the beginning, and now here. So I think it's perfectly fine to say that antitrust is not the tool for these industries in the U.S. Antitrust is a fault-based system. You're supposed to do something wrong. These companies haven't necessarily done anything wrong. And indeed, they've done some remarkable things, but that doesn't mean we should necessarily leave them unregulated.
Alex, it seems like the EU is obviously moving towards a public regulation approach.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the innovation point because it's obviously the key one. And I think it's extremely complicated to predict what will be the effect of those laws on innovation in general. Now, I mean, as Randy is saying, I mean, we have here three types of players. We have the big tech themselves, which are clearly very innovative. Nobody is denying that. And then you have the complementer of those big tech, which wants to innovate on the ecosystem of the big tech, but don't want necessarily to disrupt the big tech. That's maybe the case of Epic or maybe the case of Spotify. They don't want to create at this stage, I think, a new operating system or a new app store. And then you have those which are disruptor, which wants to say, okay, we want to replace that platform with another thing, okay? And so those are the three, let's say, main actors in the innovation in that market. And the question is, which one do you want to favor? Because of course, I mean, if the three could innovate and you can have the three, that would be the perfect. But there is a trade-off here. And what the DMA is saying is, we will favor the complementer and the disruptor, potential disruptor, over the big tech or the incumbent player, if you want. I think that's the bet which is done by the DMA. Is it a good one or a bad one? It's extremely complicated to say, and I don't think that anyone could really seriously predict what is the best things to do. But I think that it may it may increase the level of innovation, but also there is another element which is extremely important, is the direction of innovation. It's not only the level of innovation which is key, but it's also the direction of innovation. And so the bet that the DMA is doing is that by favoring when there is a trade-off, the complementer and the disruptor over the incumbent, you will increase the diversity of innovation. So I think that's a little bit the challenge. Will it work or no? I think we will have to see in 5 years or in 10 years whether indeed it has worked. Another point I wanted to make is that there is no line of business restriction in the DMA. So there is no, like it has been mentioned by Randy in the telecom. I mean, there is no prohibition for a regulated gatekeeper to go in another services. So no breakup, no line of business restriction. Opening of the platform, yes, but not the other two. Now, is it close to public utilities regulation? Yes and no, because I mean, to some extent, yes, because you have those access obligation, and that's exactly what you see in public utilities regulation. But on the other hand, I mean, we know that they are different. I mean, because we are talking about an intangible infrastructure, not a tangible infrastructure. We are talking about infrastructure where there is much more innovation and much more possibility of disruption than when you talk about a tangible infrastructure. So I think, here the element of disruptive innovation is much more present, and in a way, much more present also in the law, in the sense that the law is there to promote those disruptor innovator.
Right. I mean, one of the things that you both seem to be implying, but haven't quite said explicitly, is that all this is really about vendors, right, rather than consumers. I mean, is that accurate? Because this, normally when you hear about antitrust, you're talking about monopolies and not being fair for consumers, but here we're talking about helping other vendors get into the market. Is that right, Randy?
So consumers, that was the word I just wrote down. So I'm glad you went there. That's where I wanted to go too. I want to say two things about that, I think. So I agree. None of our conversation is focused on consumers directly. And I do think we want to, have some ideas in mind. So, Europe went through a history on the Microsoft case where they presented the browser ballot or the browser choice screen. You turned on a PC in Europe and you were presented with a choice of 14 different browsers you could pick. Take that idea, multiply it by any number of products. Is that what your new smartphone is going to look like when you turn it on to solve this self-preferencing problem? I don't know the answer to that, but that is certainly one of the possibilities associated with, I don't know, maybe the DMA and maybe the Open App Store app. And that's a change in the consumer experience that doesn't seem very attractive. Okay, second thing I want to say, look, vendors, we are talking about vendors, but vendors are out there trying to sell products to consumers. So vendors are the instruments to create consumer value. So the fact that we're talking about vendors a lot, that doesn't bother me so much, but I do want us to step back and take a look and say, what have we created and have we hurt the consumer experience today? Alex's point about innovation, we never know what's going to happen next exactly. So it's a little hard to focus on that. If you make me go through 14 choice screens for my new iPhone, I am not going to be very happy.
But do you, but just to kind of pursue that point in America, do you feel that the idea, I mean, the fact that Amy Klobuchar and others are focusing on vendors rather than consumers, apparently, is that something politically that, has some more likely to have success, I guess, do you think?
I do not understand that. I'm always big on saying I don't know what I don't know and I don't know. So I do not understand why the Democrats, I voted for Joe Biden. I'm not going to hide. I wrote a check to Joe Biden, and I don't write checks easily. But I don't understand why they think that's the play. So I just don't get that. People love their devices, maybe too much, right? That might be the tech problem we should be talking about. And so, changing, maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe it's not going to change the experience, but, Alex has lived in Europe. He saw it on Windows 7, and I take it we're seeing it with regard to the Android handsets, and multiply that by music and browser, and go down each one of these choices you would have to make. And that seems like
there is a risk, isn't there, that if you focus too much on vendors and lose sight of consumers, then the consumer experience deteriorates rapidly.
Certainly in the short run.
Yeah. Alex, any thoughts on that? I mean, is that a risk, do you think, that the EU are so focused on the market that they're losing sight of the consumer?
No. I mean, yes. I mean, I agree with what Wendy has said. I mean, the vendors, so again, what I would call the complementer or the potential disruptor, are the vehicle for competition and innovation, which which at the end of the day should benefit the user. So I don't think that that is so much of a problem. But the question is that Randy was mentioning is a very interesting one. Of course, I mean, is there a trade-off between user experience and contestability, you know? And I think to as far as possible, it should be reduced. But, and so, you know, I mean, I think you can try to organize choice screens and things like that, which are helping the user experience and yet supporting contestability. So I don't think that it's one or the other. But you know, it raised to a fundamental question, and it's a question I ask often myself when I see the Matrix movie, you know, the series of movie, you know, are the consumer welfare maximized in Matrix?
The answer there is that you maximize your welfare by watching the first, but not the second and third. Right? Just so we're crystal clear. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
He's right. That's absolutely right. But that's the point, you know, about the direction of innovation. You know, that's why you need contestability. Another. But no, my point is, you know, if you are in Matrix and you stay there and it's not contestable, yeah, maybe you are happy because your customer experience is very good. But on the long term, maybe that's not that good. And so, you know, on those issue of trade-off between consumer experience and contestability, this is an issue that you can see on the short term, but it is also an issue that you should see on a more longer term. And I think that's part of the point of the Lina Khan paper on Amazon paradox. You know, we may like or not like the idea and the person, but I think the point of, you know, having that a kind of a longer term perspective is absolutely key. And that's, I think, the objective also of the DMA. If you want, you know, contestability is a sort of long-term consumer welfare approach.
Right. That's the gamble, I guess, or that's what they're betting on. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I just want to kind of look ahead, like you were starting to. One big topic, I guess, which actually I think it was you, Alex, that raised when we were having a conversation earlier, is regulatory convergence. I mean, do you feel, both of you, that, you know, both sides of the Atlantic are kind of slowly kind of converging on this? Alex or Randy?
So, I mean, I think we have to distinguish let's say, the economic regulations, contestability, DMA, the law that Randy was mentioning, and then the content moderation, Section 230, DSA. And I think on the first one, it's probably easier to get a conversion than on the second one, because, you know, the second one is really about balancing fundamental right, and I don't think we all balance in the same way. On the first one, what I think is interesting is that we have more convergence between the EU and China than between the EU and the US. Because, you know, China also have intervened quite a lot through antitrust means against their own Chinese big tech, you know. And so what I see there is, even if we use different instruments and for different reasons, probably, quite of a convergence. The US is still the big question mark, but I think it would be extremely important to some extent to get a convergence there. But from what I see here, but I mean, I am an external observer, is that there is a lot of divergences among the Democrats themselves, you know, of course, between the Republicans and the Democrats. So, you know, whether the US will ever have a strategy on big tech regulation, that's a question mark. I think it should, and I think we should then have a kind of conversation. But, you know, because if you don't, what will happen? It will be up to the firm to decide whether you do a convergence or not, in the sense whether what will be imposed in Europe will be then also deployed in the US or not. And I think it will depend of obligation to obligation, probably some side-loading obligation or opening obligation. If they are imposed in Europe and not in the US, Apple will apply them in Europe and not in the US. Other obligation will probably be will probably be extended over the US, but without the US having a say, which I think is a huge problem of legitimacy. So,
and we're seeing that in China, obviously, right? You know, Apple that behaves differently in China than it does in the EU.
That's right. That's right. So I mean, I think, you know, the idea of a global internet, that is finished as well. I mean, that's the other big change. You know, we thought that the cyberspace, you know, I encourage everyone to read or reread the Barlow Declaration, you know, of '96 of the independence of the cyberspace, where he said there is no more border. We will create a better society than what the states have done, and that's wrong. That's simply wrong today. I mean, there is border, and the internet and the cyberspace is no better than what the states have done before. So I think that yes, we will have more and more, I think, differentiation of services across jurisdiction.
Randy?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts on that. So on the Barlow piece, yeah, the physical space and the online space ultimately reflects, alas, the full heterogeneity of who we are as human beings. And maybe online exacerbates it some, and maybe that's what the algorithms do and the like, I don't know. I think there's a possibility, as Alex was suggesting, of some convergence on the antitrust side. We'll see, it depends on whether these bills get through. I think on the DSA side, as it were, look, obviously Alex referenced in that context, Section 230. We put Section 230 in place at the beginning, right? So 230 was part of the Communications Decency Act, and that was part of the Telecommunications Act in 1996. So, and obviously the Netscape IPO is August of 1995. So we put that there at the beginning, and I think the tech industry has seen 230 as being incredibly important to its development. We're at a different point now. And a point, again, Alex said this, where it's not clear, but the Democrats and Republicans agree. I mean, the Republicans, I think, see themselves, Tom, you started with Elon Musk and Twitter, they see themselves as being disadvantaged, fairly or unfairly, I don't know, on these tech spaces. So they want more regulation. And a lot of the Democrats look at Facebook with horror. And I like Twitter. I don't spend that much time on Facebook. And so I guess I'm voting with my feet on that. But whether I'm doing 230 in class today and possible amendments, but whether we'll get changed there. And Tom, you mentioned at the very beginning, that obviously the midterms are coming up, and that will be a Washington reset, presumably.
Yeah, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I mean, we haven't even started on all the other technologies that are potential game changers, right? I mean, the metaverse, AI, and so forth, VR. I mean, can we get your thoughts just on any sense of how or whether or should these new emergent sectors be regulated?
Alex, you want to go?
No, well, I mean, if the DMA is the direction of travel, I think the metaverse, which I see it as a kind of super ecosystem, should be open. That's the issue. So, I mean, every services that are on the metaverse should be open, contestable, and the metaverse itself. But I mean, as we know, the metaverse is not, I mean, every company have its own conception. But I think really the objective of the direction of travel is the matrix, which to me is a kind of form of metaverse, should be open to complementer and disruptor. That's the direction of travel we have taken in Europe with the DMA.
So what you're saying is that the DMA, you think, will suffice, as it were, for these for a metaverse world? Do you think it will still work?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, maybe the DMA will be revised. Surely it will be revised. The EU law is very different from US law. EU law are revised every 5 years, so it's a very flexible law, if you want, in the sense that it is revised very often, which is less the case here in the US. But my point is that maybe there would be some adaptation, but the direction of travel will remain the same.
Yeah. So a couple quick thoughts, I guess. So some of this is obviously at a hardware level that we haven't really talked about at all. I don't think the bills I have in front of me will do anything about this, and obviously the DMA or DSA will. So that's certainly true on quantum. It's to some extent true on AI, though AI is presumably a data story as well, machine learning and the like. And the metaverse is clearly, Facebook, I think, now sees the metaverse as a chance to do a reset. When Mark Zuckerberg was sitting in his Harvard dorm room and came up with Face Mash, which was the original version of this product, he had no idea what was going to be unleashed. He's a much more mature adult, and he sees the possibility, as Alex said, super ecosystem of marrying this new technology platform, Oculus and the like, with a new engagement storytelling platform. So I think they're going to run hard on that. And I suspect the regulators will struggle to keep up.
Well, I think it was you, Randy, who said that, regulation is always after the act, right? And so, we have to see what the metaverse is going to look like first before it's even possible to think about how to regulate it. But it's obviously something that regulators will keep, I imagine, a very close watch on. Well, I think we're going to let leave it there. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion. There's lots more to talk about, and maybe we should kind of reconvene in a few months to see where we've got to. Maybe after the midterms would be a good time to see what the landscape looks like then. But thank you both very much indeed. Alex de Streel and Randy Picker, you've been tremendous guests and really informative. And this is being recorded, so it'll be available to watch, and you two can watch yourselves and and Monday morning quarterback it.
Good.
But thank you both very much. It's been a great time.